So now that all of the coolant lines have been disconnected, the next step, step 4, like I said before, was to remove all the ancillary stuff. So disconnect the spark plug wires, we're going to disconnect the gas lines. We're going to be careful here, these might be under pressure. You definitely don't want to do this if the engine is hot. This car has been sitting for a couple days, it's nice and cool, so it doesn't really matter if gas spills. But you know, keep a rag underneath while you disconnect the fuel lines, just in case that the fuel system is pressurized, and always wear goggles. So we're going to disconnect both the fuel feed and fuel return lines. This is for a 20 valve, might be a little bit different for the 16 valve. And we're going to remove the intake path, intake manifold. We're going to disconnect all the electrical connections. When we drop the engine, we don't want anything snagging, we don't want anything breaking. The biggest thing is to disconnect all the connectors to the ECU, which is in the trunk, and I'll show you that. Remove the igniter. I have the power distribution block here in leeway of the actual battery. I did a battery relocation. Yeah, so just all the wires, all the sensors, anything that's connecting the engine to the body, we want to disconnect so that when we drop that engine, nothing is coming with it. And the reason why we're taking off the intake system is just to make it easier to maneuver the engine when we drop it, and when we pull the car up to slide the engine out, it'll just make our lives a lot easier. So let's go ahead and do that. Pretty straightforward, pretty basic. I'm not going to run through every single connector, every single thing I'm disconnecting, but the major things I will show you, and sort of the step-by-step process here. So just an update in the process here. You can see we have the intake, or sort of part of the intake system removed. That's a very simple removal. And we have the spark plug wires out. And now we're just going to go ahead and disconnect everything that we think we need to. So everything that's connecting the engine wiring harness to the body. You don't have to disconnect all the sensor connectors because the wiring harness is going to come with the engine when we drop it. So you don't necessarily have to do that unless they're in the way. So if they're in your way as you're working, you can disconnect them, otherwise you can leave them connected. But as long as, you know, those connectors aren't actually going to the body, so only to the wiring, or the engine wiring harness. So let's just keep working, and next up here is going to be the fuel lines, and I'll give you an update when I'm further along. On the passenger side of the engine, you need to disconnect the throttle cable. So all you have to do is undo these two nuts. The cable will slide out. You just have to fiddle with it a little bit, it'll slide out, and then the throttle cable will just hang. We don't want it connected to the engine when we drop it. You want to disconnect your engine bay fan and any grounds you have on the side of the engine. Your brake booster line you need to disconnect, and otherwise it's pretty clean on this side. So let's keep working. So just an update, most of the electrical connections have been disconnected. We're still going to have to do the one going through the trunk here to the ECU and pull that through. But the big thing now we're going to do is the fuel lines, so the feed and return lines, and we're going to wear a glove, we're going to have a rag underneath. This is the return line, it's going to be not that high pressure. The feed line may be high pressure, so that may squirt a little bit. Let's do that carefully. And then we have to take off the intake manifold and a few little bits here and there. The Speedo cable, which goes to the transmission, which is right here, that just screws off, so we need to remove that. And yeah, we're almost there, almost ready to move to the next stage, which will be disconnecting the drive shafts. Alright, let's keep working. So when removing the airbox, you take off these bolts with the now in key, and you can pull off the top of the airbox. It's the silver portion here, just comes right off. Then inside you'll see these shaped trumpets. So you have to undo the 2 bolts, one on the bottom, one on the top. For each one of these bolts actually hold the airbox to the intake manifold there. So undo those and they'll come off, and then you'll be able to pull the airbox off, and that's it. That's how simple it is to take off the airbox. Once we've done that, we can move on to removing the axles and the clutch line, and then we're basically ready to go and drop the engine. So let's keep working. So the intake manifold has been removed, and you can see just how much space now we have. This is going to give us a lot of freedom when we drop the engine and we have to lift the car up and maneuver the engine around to slide it underneath. Having this extra space here is really going to help, and like I said, removing the intake manifold or the airbox, sorry, is really easy. So go ahead and do that. The last step here before we move to the drive shafts is, like I said before, to remove the Speedo gear. It's just a screw-on type for this engine. So all we're going to do is just take a pair of pliers and just unscrew it, and then that cable will just hang, because that cable goes to your Speedo on the dash, which basically tells you how fast you're going. So unscrew that, and then we'll move on to the drive shafts, clutch line, and then we're about ready to go. Alright, so a Speedo cable is removed. There is one major thing that I totally forgot to do, and we'll do it right now, is disconnect the engine wiring harness from the ECU. So you have to go into your trunk, and we're going to disconnect all the connectors that go from the engine wiring harness to the body wiring harness and the ECU. We also have the engine fan controller and the circuit opening relay. So we're just going to disconnect all these, and then we're going to pull them through the hole in the trunk here, and that's going to go with the wiring the engine wiring harness when we drop the engine. So let's go ahead and do that now, and then we're ready for stage 5, which is like I said, axles. So you can see one right there and one right here. We're gonna have to disconnect it from the transmission. It's just a bunch of nuts, then we can pull it out. Then the clutch line, and one thing I also forgot to mention was the gear selector, what are they called? Cables. So there's 2 cables right here, and those are for your gear selector for the manual transmission, and we need to disconnect that from the transmission before we drop the engine. That will be in stage 5, or sorry, step 5. So let's go ahead and do that now.